So dudes, I think it's fair to say that Rainbow Six Siege is just not in a particularly healthy state right now. It's the reason I've been cranky. It's probably the reason other content creators have been cranky too. I don't say that because I like saying it. I don't think that it's a good position for anyone to be in. Unfortunately, even if certain aspects of the game's engineering are addressed, that's the back-end stuff like the code, the engine, the cheating situation. Even if those are addressed, the game still has some mechanical issues that I think Ubisoft doesn't want to address out loud for fear of alienating certain parts of their player base. So in this video, I wanted to talk about some solutions that I think could make everybody happy in terms of resetting stuff, allowing us to go back to the drawing board, and having a solid plan of what we want out of this game in terms of design. You hate lag? Of course you do. You have Linksys by Cisco in your office right now. I cannot play Rainbow Six Siege with my British friends, said you. The transatlantic data center has not been approved by Joe Biden, put up in the middle of the ocean, but we have a solution. We have Gear Up Booster, and it can help you. Every continent doesn't have just one big data center. There's actually a bunch of different subset data centers. You might be getting routed to a server you don't want to be routed to, even though it would be the most efficient one for you. So Gear Up Booster helps you do that. Gear Up has full access to network carriers and game servers across the entire continent. The service helps deal with packet loss and is especially useful for individuals playing on foreign servers. For instance, if you're on an Australian server and you want to play with your friends from a different one. It also helps stabilize network connection, which is useful if your ISP isn't that great. If you need a little ping pick-me-up, go to the link in the description or in the pinned comment and download Gear Up Booster for free. So if you're not familiar with why I think the game is not healthy right now, let me elaborate. To put it simply, the game is just not fun to play. In some parts, the mechanical nature of the game and the way it's being played has something to do with that, but the cheating situation is becoming increasingly untenable, which makes ranked uninteresting to me. Standard doesn't have the rule set or the map pool that I particularly like, and Quick Match 2.0 is just a dreadful idea. I'm 100% with Bikini Bodhi on the whole screw Quick Match 2.0 thing. But what I think will ultimately remain after, or if the cheating thing has a sustainable solution put in place, is the game's mechanical nature. Specifically, the laser beam recoil guns and one-shot headshot. One-shot headshot is codified as a realistic mechanic. It's supposed to add to the grit and authenticity of the game, and it's supposed to reward precision to make any gunfight winnable under the right circumstances. The game also has pretty fast time to kill just in general. What a lot of people don't put together, though, is that this is pretty unusual for a game like Siege. Siege is not a fast-paced, arcadey shooter like Call of Duty. You can't slide cancel, dive, jump shot, or any of that. But you do retain a pretty significant amount of control over your spray in Siege, compared to a game like Counter-Strike. In Siege, you can move and shoot pretty comfortably at the same time. You can fall through the air and shoot. Siege is a tactical shooter, and I resoundingly disagree with anybody who demands that it's not. And very few games have as many different parts as Siege. But because the game is in this weird liminal space it's in right now, it's prompted a ton of people to not characterize it as a tactical shooter. So I went back to a lot of old footage and studied it. It's true that the game went through a pretty significant art style and tonal shift. Was it as quirky and lackadaisical as Overwatch or Valorant? No, but it definitely got a little creative with the Tom Clancy brand. However, the difference between the mechanical design and the artistic theme are not the same thing. Just because the game has a certain kind of vibe does not mean the game will play out with that vibe. If you look at something like Counter-Strike, it's considerably more tactical, in quotes, than modern Siege. But it's not a realistic game by any stretch of the imagination. I think the only reason people have this idea that Siege was more quote-unquote tactical back in 2016 is because they didn't run into bolo peeking yet. Chances are they encountered bolo peeking and then they just stopped playing. When I first started playing the game in 2015, my overlap was with Counter-Strike. So when I got to this game, I didn't really care about realism because it's a game. It seemed like over time, the game has tried to get back to its roots mechanically, but artistically, it doesn't line up. So there's this insistence that the game is losing its roots. I see people talk about how this game should have came out back in 2014 all the time. Well, the game shares more in common with this kind of slowness now than it did back in 2014. What's changed is there's a microtransaction shop. That's it. Let's go from the top. Lean speed, movement speed, gun handling in general, and tons of other things have been adjusted to be a million times slower than they were back in the day. In the shooter space, usually when you start slowing things down, you get met with negativity. I was one of the weird people that really liked Modern Warfare 2's multiplayer. As a Siege player for 8 years, I really appreciated the attempt at making a more methodical and tactical Call of Duty. When Siege slowed down, it was able to do so relatively successfully. When Call of Duty slowed down, Activision forced Sledgehammer to work on a brand new game with a 1.5 years worth of development time just to make up for the lost sales from the previous game. No matter what anybody says, Siege is not Call of Duty. But it's not Ready or Not. And this was the game that was advertised in 2015. Now, when I look at frames like this, my initial thinking goes along the lines of, this is dumb. If you stack up like this, you're just going to get C4'd. You're going to get flanked by a 16-year-old. What the devs learned in 2016 is that there are people who sink lots of time into FPS games and will take advantage of any minor positioning mistakes you make or lapses in awareness. For the purpose of making differentiations, I'm not putting the inverse of this, the tac shooter crowd, in the same audience as people who insist that Siege is Call of Duty. I know that the average not idiot understands that Siege is not Call of Duty. It's kind of a don't make fun of my hometown thing. Only people from your hometown are allowed to talk shit about your hometown. Only people who play Siege are allowed to say it's Call of Duty. My point in making this differentiation is that if you don't play Siege, I don't trust you to ascertain whether it's Call of Duty or not. A lot of the times when I hear somebody say Siege is just Call of Duty now, it's just a roundabout way of saying that you lost your gunfight. Like, yeah, there are some more aggressive aspects of the meta that I think need to be addressed, and I think the game is certainly more gunfight focused than it's ever been, but that doesn't mean that every time you lose a gunfight, it's because of the TDM meta. It just means you lost a gunfight. So the devs made a game in 2016 with this kind of energy, but the game never actually played out like this in reality. It wasn't because they didn't try, it's because they didn't consider what people were actually going to do with their game when they got it in their hands. I don't think that the devs ever anticipated bolo leaning. Mainly because I don't think the average tac shooter guy, or average shooter player in general, even considered that people were able to stretch the mechanics to that extent. Siege in many ways is an example of what the difference between on paper and in execution look like. If you want people to play Siege like this, with the cool tactical gear, with the emphasis on the CTU stuff, and the lack of microtransactions that will never go away, the game never should have shipped the way it did in 2016. But it did. And it wasn't doing well at launch. We all like to conveniently forget that this game was essentially, for the most part, dead at launch. Why? Because it was a Tom Clancy game with no single player. Tom Clancy was an author. People had certain expectations about what was evident in a Tom Clancy license. To be 100% frank, I don't know how much longer that Tom Clancy diehards will last as a marketable audience. XDefiant got canned so hard with its initial press release that they had to take the Tom Clancy name off. I don't disagree with that decision. If it's clear that things are untenable and unsustainable with a target demographic, a target audience, it's probably best to just move on. There is a component of this that feels like the only way Ubisoft can satisfy everybody is if they get a time machine and go back to 2005. The reason Siege leaned into the we care about what works in a multiplayer sense was because the game was trying to compete directly with Counter-Strike. Counter-Strike had the whole terrorist versus counter-terrorist thing, but obviously was not realistic. This approach didn't work for Siege because no matter what you do, you're going to associate it with the Tom Clancy Rainbow Six brand. And the vast majority of Tom Clancy Rainbow Six fans didn't want something like Counter-Strike. They wanted a single-player narrative experience. That was Rainbow Six Patriots before it was canceled, which I think most people can agree turned into Rainbow Six Siege, since it seems like Rainbow Six Siege was just the multiplayer component of Rainbow Six Patriots. In a different timeline, Rainbow Six Patriots comes out, has a multiplayer scene that maybe gets turned into an esport eventually, and maybe there's a Rainbow Six Patriots 2 that comes out in 2017. But that's not what happened. Regardless of what everybody thinks now, Siege came out the gate half-baked. It didn't have a ton of options in 2016, so they dove into the multiplayer, because that's the only content that was available. For the sake of the license, I'm glad they did this, or I don't think we'd even have a Rainbow Six to talk about right now. The common counter-argument I hear to this is, good, it should have died, which I think is just really jaded and cynical, and an unrealistic expectation. If a company doesn't have to cut losses, they're not going to do it. What I find more frustrating than anything, though, and this goes back to 2016, is that this decision was followed up by a demand to keep up with the rest of the mainstream shooter market, instead of keeping in line with other tac shooters. I think people have this idea that a tac shooter vibe and an esports component are mutually exclusive and incompatible. I think Siege proves that this is not true. Siege has had this problem of double dipping though for a long time. It wants to retain a player base, so it can't go completely down the milsim route, as that's for a niche audience on PC. And it can't go down the arcade shooter route because the game will lose its identity. It's been on this tightrope of a balancing philosophy for a long time. Well, if the weird little gun whack-a-mole phenomenon is evidence to me of anything, it's clear to me that the Ubisoft dev team wants the game to be more tactical, but they're not really sure how to approach it. So if you want the game to be more tactical, I think you just really gotta nut up and pick what you want. If you want it to be a mainstream, widely appealing tac shooter, not just a niche community thing, I'll use my time spent playing Hell Let Loose recently for inspiration. So first of all, one of the reasons that I think Rainbow Six Siege struggles to retain the tac shooter guys is the laser beam recoil. Personally, I don't get why we've been piecemeal recoil nerfing the problematic recoil gun of the month for so long. It's clear that Ubisoft is unhappy with just the overall way the gunplay is codified. So I would suggest, if we want to do it, just go back to the drawing board, get rid of the laser beam recoil completely. I'm not talking just add a crap ton to an arbitrary degree. I mean, really think about how the guns kick, sway your camera, how they enunciate themselves, stuff like that. Maybe we get to a point where full auto is just not practical anymore. This isn't a LARP. Okay, let's be real, it kind of is. But you can make it into a mechanic. Remember when the game had select fire? Everybody got mad at that, right? Well, they didn't articulate why they were mad. Like, yeah, there were people trying too hard to LARP and pretended like it gave you some kind of tactical advantage. It didn't. It was a waste of time, but it made you feel cool, so they liked it. They just didn't want to say that out loud. I think it would have been fine to just say that out loud, but this is the internet. If the game was designed with that in mind, it would have been a different story. So here's my idea. This is just an idea I've written off the top of my head, so feel free to tell me if there's a better way to implement this. This is kind of just in the ballpark. So, I'm talking one-shot kills for 7.62 rifles. 5.56 one-shots to the upper chest, maybe 2 shots to the lower torso, where an armor plate could be kept. Limb shots, obviously, reduce damage. For armor systems, you would have 3 armors with a heavy plate, 2 armors with a light plate, and 1 armors don't have a plate at all, but maybe they get an additional secondary gadget or something. Maybe they have like a harness or a carrier that gives them more grenades. Aha. So, Ella has a deployable shield and barbed wire. That's kind of cool, right? So obviously SMGs would have to remain viable for full auto, but you get the idea. This system wouldn't be meant to emulate real life. Okay, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to make a LARP milsim. Rather, it would just try to embrace the tac shooter stuff in a way that codifies their design and is still competitively viable and sound. You could probably add a stamina system or slow the movement down overall too. That's my idea for a more boomer-fied Siege. Now, this is going to be hugely unpopular with a wide range of people, particularly the esports crowd, but I think it's only going to be unpopular in the marketing. If this was done right, the average person might actually get their hands on it and have a completely different idea. They might find they're able to still rely on their mechanical skill in the same way they were before and not feel alienated. It's just that now, the gunplay would have a bigger emphasis on a couple of clicks rather than full auto sprays and feel a little bit more satisfying for the people who enjoy that. My proposal is not really Rainbow Six Siege. It's kind of just a different Rainbow Six game entirely. But it's one that I think you could do with this ecosystem well, with the right people behind it. The goal of my proposal is to retain some of Siege's roots, while not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and ignoring the esports component that's kept it alive. If we can have our cake and eat it too, I'm cool with that. This is just an idea. It's not hugely tested. It's not extensively looked over. But if my time playing Hell Let Loose has taught me anything, is that there is a market for the dad shooter. And I think the kids might enjoy playing the dad shooter along these lines if you present it in a way that makes sense. So if you want to explain it like a completely different game, you don't even have to call it Siege. You could call it like Rainbow Six Coalition or something. Maybe you'll have room for a single player campaign. And maybe, if the game gets hot enough, we could have a Rainbow Six XCOM spinoff. That's all I got. These are just ideas I'm throwing around. I know that people hate the games industry and think that there's just no chance in hell of any good ideas ever happening again. But this is still my job, so I have to at least yap about it. So if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and share it with your friends if you like the ideas I had to say. Thanks for watching. Deuces.